Well, my last two videos produced definitely the most positive feedback I've ever gotten. I had one other video that had the word porn in the title, and that actually got more views, although it wasn't actually porn. But in terms of positive comments, I got a number of personal PMs that were pretty nice and some responses. So I'm happy about that. It's always nice to get that kind of feedback. So this is kind of going to be a response to Ideological, who says that I'm his favorite YouTuber. So I'm very flattered by that. And just to get it out there, since you asked, my name is pronounced Length-Unother. Length-Unother. It's a long story as to why that is my YouTube name, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but it's pronounced funny because it is Icelandic. It is not English. It's spelled in English, but it's Icelandic. But Length-Unother. So I wanted to talk again about Ron Paul. Now, this is fast becoming a Ron Paul cheerleading channel, and there's a hesitation on my part to be that way. Not because I think it destroys my credibility, because I think I'm pretty fair about Paul, and I don't only sing his praises, and I qualify my support to him. I'm interested in a lot of other things, and like if you look, before I made those two videos, I made a video on Mesopotamia and the Bronze Age. And I really would love to make more videos about that, but very few people watch them. They just are not usually seen as that interesting. And while I find them interesting, if you share something and other people don't come to hear it, then there's less incentive to hear it. But if you make a video on Ron Paul, you get a lot of views. Obviously, people are interested in hearing that. So I'm not to say that I'll never make anything other than Ron Paul videos anymore, but it sounds like I'll be making a lot. And also, it's a contemporary thing that's going on right now. And Ron Paul is very interesting just because he actually is dealing with real ideological issues. It's not just, I think most political campaigns, they're just kind of like a horse race. And, in a horse race, it's just whatever horse is fastest, really. There's no... And that can be interesting, and that can be, oh, that's a very fast horse, and we can look at a politician that, wow, that's a killer politician. He really, gives a good speech or whatever, gives a good stump speech and has, the right pedigree or whatever. But it's not much more interesting, beyond that, it's not very interesting. And with Paul, he brings in all this debate about the role of government, but more than that, I think we see... Through him, we can gauge where the society is in terms of its ideas for liberty. How much, what kind of reception he gets, how good it is, where he gets a good reception. It's really an extremely good litmus test, I think. And so it's very interesting. Now, libertarians, and especially anarchist libertarians, of which I think there's a growing number, and I think largely because of Paul, although certainly not exclusively because of Paul, have misgivings about him because his success, to the extent that he has it, is political. And yet I think it's clear also that he, like I said in the video about Paul, that he's aiming for ideological change. He is trying to change people's minds and their opinions. And it seems like it's very hard to distinguish between the two, and I think the reason is that they are reciprocal, that they feed off of each other. So, there's lots of minarchists like Paul that have, he has a certain eclectic mix on his libertarianism. There's a couple of views that he has that are kind of unusual. He's much more pro-life than many libertarians, although I think that's changing. And, he has... Libertarians aren't all the same, and he has kind of a unique mix, but so do all libertarians to his ideology. But the reason he's up there is not because his particular mix of libertarianism is so compelling. It's just that he has been a congressman. And so it's one thing to say, here, I found this guy, and his name is Murray Rothbard, or his name is, Sheldon Richman, or any number of other libertarians who have existed, and you just say, well, they're just a writer. They write a few op-eds. They've written a few books. They've written a few articles. Maybe they're some of the more famous ones have occasionally been like commentators on TV. But then you have a guy who, well, he's a congressman, and all of a sudden, right or wrong, he has more legitimacy. He has his views have to be given more weight than they otherwise would. And we can, I mean, if you're like me, you think that an argument should be based on the argument and how logical it is and how much evidence there is for it, not whether the person who says it has gotten the majority of some electorate to vote to them at one particular time. Especially since they're not actually voting on the argument. They're voting on that person, not necessarily anything else. But so Ron Paul, because of his position in Congress, has just had a bigger microphone. And we can say, well, it's not good that just because he's in Congress he gets a bigger microphone. But the fact is he does. And so he has been able to get a message out in a way that nobody else has, and to put a veneer of legitimacy on it that it otherwise would never have. And like I said again, we don't have to say we agree with that veneer, but it's just the truth. Now, were he to become president, you could say, well, there are all the political things he could do, which actually I think he could do a lot more. People say he can't pass legislation. That is true, but he can, in effect, nullify legislation because of the ability to pardon. And people are picking up on this, especially when it comes to the drug war. But he could go and say anybody who gets arrested by the EPA or charged by a crime for failing to live up to certain regulations, or say someone works for a job and they work for less than minimum wage, and their employer gets arrested, and he just says, you know what, I pardon you, and he pardons everybody else. That would mean, in effect, that those regulations are nullified, because anybody who got charged with them would be pardoned, which would mean many more people would do it, which would also mean that prosecutors would just say, well, this is pointless. Why am I going to waste money and time when the president is just going to pardon the person I'm prosecuting? That doesn't make any sense. And so they'd actually probably stop doing it. And then we'd have however long Paul remained in office. And I'm not predicting this will happen in everything, although apparently there's very likely that it will happen at least for drugs, which if you had to pick one, that would be the one, because it imprisons the most people. But you'd have the remainder of his presidency, whether he had 2 terms or not, and we would basically have a nullified regulatory state, which I think even though the taxes are horrible and everything, that the regulations are actually worse. They really tie our hands. And I think that you would see an enormous growth and prosperity. Basically, unemployment would involuntary unemployment. There's always going to be some unemployment because some people just don't want to work for a little bit, or they're between jobs or whatever. Keynes was totally silly to think that we don't have to have full employment. That's silly, but it would be very good for the country. And even once he's out of office, say, assuming the next person isn't as good as him, which is almost certain unless like his son got elected, they would have to basically put the genie back in the bottle, which is possible. If you think about it, that did happen in the United States before, but it was a very gradual process. It took literally decades, even centuries, for it to happen. And so if Ron Paul undid that year, a whole 140, 150 years of regulation, it would be very hard for another incumbent to just redo it, right away. And there would be a much bigger backlash. Just if like, I don't know, in the 1880s, some president had basically come up and tried to create the country we have today, it never would have happened. There would have been such a huge backlash. Now, it wouldn't be exactly like that, because in the 1880s they would have had all this history before that, and we would be only talking about a Paul presidency. But it would be much more difficult than people think, and that's good. But it does, the other things, though, that's what he could do politically as president. Obviously, he could bring the troops home. So those are big things. But when he gets elected, if he does, which I think is possible, I still think it's a long shot. He's going to give an inaugural address, and it's probably going to be the most important inaugural address ever. He's going to talk about things that no other president has ever talked about, and everyone's going to have to listen. I mean, not everyone. They don't coerce people to watch the inaugural, thankfully, but tens and tens of millions of people are going to have to watch that. And every commentator on the news, they're going to have to talk about what he says. they're not, if he gives an inaugural address, they're not going to be able to do like they've been doing and say, well, let's talk about Tim Pawlenty today or Newt Gingrich or anything like that. They're going to have to say, okay, Ron Paul is saying basically that we should dissolve almost all the government and that we should be, basically have a libertarian society. And I'm sure that they won't agree with that, but they're going to have to talk about it. And anybody who watches it is going to have to talk about it. And I think this is only to the good. And so what kind of influence is that? Is it political or is it ideological? Well, the two are related. He would have a platform because he is president. And his words would be meaningful because he is president. And I think my kind of wet dream about a Paul presidency is that he basically nullifies all these laws, he pardons a whole bunch of people, and then he actually resigns. That's what I think would be. And he would quote Mises, because Mises was once asked, what would you do if you could be made king? And he said, I would resign. I would abdicate, is what he said. Because he knew that no one can do what the king is supposed to do. And I think that would be just awesome. I don't know that he would ever do that. But I think I could just see him coming on TV and just giving a speech and quoting Mises and being like, listen, nobody can be your president. And he would have so much, he would be eternally famous, and then every other president after him would look like a douchebag, because it would be like, well, Ron Paul, who was duly elected president, said no one can do this job, and anyone who attempts to do it is conceited and full of hubris and wants to dominate and rule over us and should not be trusted and is our enemy. It'd be one thing like Nixon, he leaves because he's been discredited because he was a criminal. If you leave on absolutely unimpeccable moral high ground like Paul would do, I wish he would do. I don't have any evidence that he would do this, although it could be. All the subsequent presidents would look like they were conceited, hubristic douchebags, and that would be very good. So the balancing his political and his purely ideological influences is basically impossible. You could draw a line, but it would be arbitrary because his fame has been because of politics, and but he's used the fame as an educational tool, and I firmly believe that this has always been his intent. If you look at the history of his work, his extensive and long work with Rothbard, and I mentioned it to you, I think, in a PM or something, or on Facebook, that Ideological, for those of you who don't realize who I'm referencing. I'm pretty sure that Ron Paul is basing his entire philosophy around Albert J. Nock's Isaiah's Job essay, which is a very, very biblical kind of based essay about, look, you just have to be the honest person in a world full of lies and deceit and evil. If you are the honest person, then the honest people will find you. If you're speaking the truth to power, it's true that most of society is going to either completely ignore you or revile you, for pointing out their injustice and their iniquity. But those people who are, I don't want to say, well, better, I mean, who have higher standards will come to you. And that has happened to Paul. When he was in Congress, while he's in Congress, he's always had this very wide base of support outside of his district. Because if you believed in the Constitution, or if you believed in libertarianism, or you believed in free markets or human rights, he was your champion and probably your only champion. I mean, on some issues, there might be two or three other people, and there's a mixed bag kind of, but someone who'd be right on so much. So he has drawn on their support for decades, and they were the initial cadre of his support in his last electoral run. And then I don't know what it was. A big part of it had to be the financial collapse, but I don't think that was the only thing that happened. Obviously, the other big thing predates that slightly is the internet. And I think this remnant, which is what Albert J. Nock refers to the good people as the remnant, which I believe is a reference to them being a remnant of, say, Israel or the righteous. And if you actually read The Remnant is something that a lot of libertarians reference, and it's a reference to this Knockian notion. If you read Jacob Hubert wrote a book called Libertarianism Today, which is an excellent rundown on libertarianism today. He wrote it last year, I think, in maybe in January 2010. And it's a very good primer on libertarianism, and it covers a lot. But at the end, he dedicates it to the remnant. And I think you have the remnant, you have the internet, and I think some kind of critical mass is reached where the movement, instead of being this relatively stable number of people, or maybe something that was growing trickily, started to grow much faster. Now, I don't want to say exponentially or algorithmically or anything like that, but I think it began to grow much faster. And Ron Paul is right at the nexus of that. He's where the internet meets the financial crisis meets popular culture, and it would be one thing if that nexus was kind of a half-assed conservative, like, I don't know, Jim DeMint, or somebody who's kind of right on this or that, but so better than average, but really not that pure. With Ron Paul, there's very little that you can complain with totally. I know that libertarians disagree with him on some things. Like, I see a lot of libertarians who dismiss him because of abortion, but he has a very strong NAP, non-aggression principle argument for his position on abortion. That I've never seen any of the naysaying libertarians actually argue, because his argument is just that, look, once it becomes after conception, it's a human life, and killing it is homicide. It's, a woman doesn't have a right to her body to kill a fetus any more than I have a right to use my hands to strangle somebody to death. Now, we can disagree about that and say, no, I don't believe that human life begins at conception. I can understand that. But I never hear that argument made. I always hear it just, oh, he wants to aggress against women, he's against women. That's just absurd and doesn't do any justice to the argument that he makes. Which, again, I say you can't argue with, but most people don't. That's another side issue, though, about abortion. So, I personally, I think that he is putting the message out there, and so as long as he's going to do that, he has my support. It's important that this message be put out there and that it confront the alternative versions of society, the competing versions of society that have, been in place for a long time, and they don't have a lot of intellectual rigor, but they have conservative bias. That's what we've had, and so there's a default position to just say, well, that's what we've had, so that's what we need, which is interesting because there's very few people, Republican or Democrat, who will come out and say straight up that everything's fine and that society's running good and that status quo is good. Almost everyone will say, yeah, we need a change. But then most people, what they propose is extremely status quo, or will exacerbate the status quo by doing the parts of the status quo that are bad, they would exacerbate that. So the liberals out there who just knee-jerk think that every problem is because the government doesn't have enough power or enough money. Every time. The government has grown continually since World War II. After World War II, after the big wars, there's always a cutback. It never goes back to the way it was before. During the World War II, I think it decreased by either a third or two-thirds at the end. I don't remember. That's a big difference. So, it was one of the two, which was still bigger than it was prior to the war, but it was much smaller. But since then, it's grown the whole time. And this whole, but the tax rate for this one bracket is slightly less. It doesn't matter if it taxes slightly less. If it spends more, then it's bigger. If it has more regulations, then it's more powerful. That's all there is to it, And, the Republicans are more like, they don't like the status quo when there's a Democrat, and then when there is, they'll defend, the status quo ad nauseum. So, all those ideas they'll have going for them is that there's conservative bias, and people just think, okay, we've had that. Paul is proposing something different. We must be skeptical about it, and it's okay to be skeptical about it and to really flesh out the ideas, but to just dismiss them as being a big change, that's not fair, and that's not intellectually honest. And he's become a powerful enough force politically. And that's not to say he's going to win, but he's powerful enough that it's really hard to ignore him. In fact, it's not possible any longer. And if you look at the kind of the methodology for ignoring him, first it was to ignore him. Then it was kind of describe him as kooky, but now I think there's an understanding that people don't want to, media commentators and other politicians don't want to condescend. They don't want to have, like I said in the other video, they don't really want to debate an empire or a welfare state, that's morally bankrupt. So now their big thing is he's just not electable. He can't be elected, hence that's why he's not electable. I mean, it's kind of circular reason. He's unelectable because he's unelectable. You need to have a reason why he's unelectable. I definitely think he is electable. Obviously, he's been elected numerous times, and the people in his district, it's not like that district in Texas is just full of libertarians. Like, it's not. It would be one thing if the Mises Institute was there and the Cato Center was there and the Koch brothers lived there and everybody who worked there was a Koch employee. Then we could say, okay, obviously that's how Ron Paul got elected. I mean, it's a conservative district on the coast of Texas. There's nothing. It's not as bad as the real socialist districts like in New York City or LA or Chicago or something, but it's pretty run-of-the-mill as far as electoral districts go around the country, at least as far as I can tell. I mean, I used to live not far from there, and I used to, I don't know it real well. My employer actually, I didn't live there, but my employer was actually in his district for a while. And, they're not hardcore libertarians. They think he's right on a couple issues and it's worth voting for him. And then I think after that he became famous, and I was like, oh, he's famous, so we want to vote. I mean, that's just my take on it. But as long as he's going to be spreading this message and confronting the evil message of the alternative ideologies, he's worth supporting. And that doesn't mean we excuse him if he does something wrong, if he's made mistakes. If he makes future mistakes, if he gets elected and becomes a tyrant, which is unlikely, but it is possible, then he has to become our enemy. And, we can't, but I don't think we need to worry about that because his supporters are way too free thinking, I think, to fall for that. They're not going to be Obama zombies. And I mean, that's my view. We'll find out if it ever comes to that. I doubt it, though. So, again, thanks for the kind words. And, I don't know. That's it.